without further ado, I wanted to introduce longtime and renowned activist, L.A. Kauffman. Here at Versa, we had the pleasure of publishing her book, Direct Action, and recently her most recent book with UC Press, How to Read a Protest. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to L.A. and make her own introductions.
Thank you, Wes. All right. Does this work if I take it off? Yeah, I like it better like this. All right, so how's the sound quality? Can everybody hear okay? Yeah. Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We have an incredible lineup of folks here tonight to put our heads together and really think hard about strategy and movement building in this extraordinary moment in American history. To my left, Maurice Mitchell is the executive director of the Working Families Party. He's an organizer with more than 20 years of experience in community organizing, electoral politics, and social movements. He was the organizing director for Citizen Action of New York in the past. And the way that I met him, he plays a big role in the story that I tell in Direct Action about the unfolding of the movement in Ferguson, Missouri. He played a very major role in bridging between the local organizing and national organizing that took place there, and both at the time of the initial upsurge in Ferguson and in the period since, has been a major player in the movement for Black Lives. He is also featured, since we're at a book publisher, I brought some other books to show off. Barbara Ransby's new book, Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 20th Century. This book came out last year. It's a terrific account of the movement for Black Lives, and I highly recommend it. It includes a discussion of some of Maurice's work with Blackbird, which is an anchor organization within the movement for Black Lives that provides strategic support and guidance to groups and individuals throughout the country. And then when did you become the director of Working Families?
August 1st.
So just before things got a little bit busy in progressive electoral work, and as some of you, I hope know, Working Families Party played a really important role in midterm electoral work in a number of states, including in getting rid of the IDC in New York and getting rid of Governor Walker in Wisconsin, right? So can we get a round of applause for Maurice Mitchell? And it is an incredible honor to have the great Frances Fox Piven here with us tonight. She's one of the country's most influential scholars of social movements. Her work has been absolutely path-breaking for many decades, as well as an accomplished political organizer. I've had a lot of a really wonderful time over the last week or so rereading some of your works that I hadn't read for some years. It was really a great pleasure to reread her Poor People's Movements, is of course the foundational work that she wrote with Richard Cloward back in the 1970s. She's the author of many subsequent books, including Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, Why They Fail, Why Americans Don't Vote and Why Politicians Like It That Way, and Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America. So we get a nice round of applause for Frances Fox Piven. And many of you may have first gotten to know Ana Maria Archila after her now very famous confrontation in an elevator with Senator Jeff Flake during the Kavanaugh nomination fight, when she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're telling all women that they don't matter," which of course was how we ended up voting in the end. But that direct action intervention bought crucial time that allowed people to make a lot more noise and friction around that nomination. And I continue to think we would have had a different ruling in that Planned Parenthood ruling that happened very early in this Supreme Court's term if it had not been for the organizing against Kavanaugh. But Ana Maria Archila has been a leading organizer in New York and in the field of immigrant rights for quite some time. She was the executive director of Make the Road New York, and she is now the co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy, which has done a lot of really crucial work over many years, but some really decisive work in the Trump era, fighting against Obamacare repeal, fighting to try to defeat the tax cuts, and of course the fight around Kavanaugh. So let's get a round of applause for Ana Maria Archila. So, we're in this, I almost always open up when I'm talking about protest and organizing in this time by reminding people something that I think most of us don't feel in our bones and we need to remember, which is that we are mobilized right now in larger numbers than really we ever have been in American history. We may not feel the collective power of that all the time, but if you look at the numbers, either as absolute numbers of people participating in protests or as a percentage of the population, we have a higher level of mobilization. Somewhere between 16 and 22 million people took part in protests in the first 18 to 20 months of Trump's term. So we have these extraordinary levels of mobilization, and we have seen that work channeled in a lot of different directions. I'm going to be asking our speakers to talk about what they're seeing that they see as most promising that's happened in the period since Trump took office. But we are in a moment where there's certain kinds of impact that we can see. We can see what happened in the midterms. We can see how many races were flipped. Thanks to really grassroots ground hustle, not thanks to the Democratic Party, but thanks to grassroots efforts outside the Democratic Party. But we are in a moment of, still extraordinary peril and crisis right now. We had some, big wins, but there have been, as with the Kavanaugh fight, some very tough and bitter losses. And we're facing, with this government shutdown, a very uncertain near-term future as well as longer-term future. Now, I was just part of a project. I was one of the lead creators of this project that launched last week, the Unprecedented Washington Post. Which we started long before, where it says ending crisis, it says the lead headline says Trump hastily departs White House, ending crisis. And when we wrote that headline, we didn't realize the government was going to be shut down. We thought it was supposed to be a crisis that was created by popular movements. But the paper is a story that basically extrapolates from the resistance that we have now. So it is a women-led, grassroots, multiracial upsurge of organizing in the story in the newspaper that over the course of the next few months, by May 1st, ends up pushing Trump from office. The paper is bundled with an action guide with strategy tips for how to, it's called Bye Bye 45, a guide to bringing him down. And I very carefully write that bringing him down can mean anything from frustrating his policy objectives and making him feel bad, to driving him out of office, to defeating him at the ballot box in 2020. And it's sort of up to us to see what we create out of that moment. So that is obviously a very optimistic view of what our movements might accomplish over the next few months. But so tonight I think we're going to dig into, we're going to, I hope, hold on to the sense of bold possibility as we talk and try to dream big, but also ground this in reality. It was very fun to work on a project where we just fantasized about what our movements might do. But certainly, like Frances's body of work cautions us against organizers thinking that they can direct the course of movements through pure will. That there are structural factors always that delineate what and define what we can and can't accomplish in a given moment. So let me start by asking each of you to give your take on the organizing that you've seen happen since Trump took office. All of you bring many years of experience to this work. What's distinctive in this time? What do you see being different or especially noteworthy, both in terms of strengths, we always want to talk about the strengths, but also in terms of areas where our movements have perhaps been weaker or less adroit than we wish they could be. Maurice, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one significant aspect of this particular wave that started on Election Day in 2016 is what I think it did for millions of white people who I think had up until that point been able to avoid some of the deep contradictions of capitalism and democracy, and almost instantaneously had to confront many of those things. And it mobilized a lot of previously seemingly relatively comfortable people and effectively, in some cases, radicalized them en masse. And so that was significant to me. I mean, I think it was hard for a lot of folks, a lot of working class and poor folks, especially working class and poor folks of color, to kind of wrestle with that moment where people who were full adults recognized that we lived in a very, very unjust society, right? And it took one of the most powerful people on the planet losing an election for them to see that. But that was the contradiction that many people needed to see. And it had to be that stark and accessible to them. And it was, to me, a breakdown of some of the institutions of liberal democracy that many folks had grown to feel comfortable accepting. Because most people, including me, I thought Hillary was going to win. And in that moment of, I guess, that disorienting moment, I think it created a moment of rupture for folks, and people were able to see their society anew. And I think that to me, feels really different than the period before that. And so that, to me, is something there's something very racialized, and there's something very both very racialized and stratified around class, around how people received what happened in November 2016. Previous to that, I've been working in the movement for Black Lives, and we had been calling for a massive restructuring of our economy and democracy, confrontation of white supremacy. Previous to that, because many people felt like we were in a crisis already, and so I welcome that, because one of the reasons why I started in Working Families Party is that I strongly believe that in order for us to actually achieve that transformation, we have to develop a real multiracial alignment. And so I welcome all those folks that previous to that point were not engaged. I welcome their engagement. And now it's about how do we make that engagement something more than the opposition to Trump, and sort of like going back to sort of the neoliberal sort of order, and actually creating a really bold, visionary sort of platform and agenda for the future, right? And so that's what I'm interested in doing now. All of those folks how are we organizing them towards what we want versus what we're opposed?
Well, I think that we are in the middle of a kind of movement moment in American and world history. Those movement moments don't occur so frequently. In American history, they have been extraordinarily important. They have been the force. It's movement moments that have given us what we think of as the humane aspects of American politics and society. And I also think that there's something very distinctive about this movement moment. You know, I've been around a long time. I remember the sort of fading days of the Black freedom movement and how all the smart people began to say, we have to choose between movements and electoral politics, that if you do electoral politics, that subverts movements, it co-opts movements, which to some extent it does. And movement people scorned electoral politics, which was just a way in which people got sucked into the system. But in this period of time, it's really rather brief, 2 years now, an entirely different perspective on the relationship of movements and electoral politics has developed. And it's, I think, a much more correct, authentic perspective on what the one has to do with the other. Because it's true that there's something co-opting about electoral politics. People want to run for office, and we don't know where Alexandria is going to be in 5 years. We have to wait and see. We hope she'll be with us, but it's also the case that it's extremely important for movements to have a kind of foothold in electoral politics. It's important to movements to have politicians in office with decision-making power that have to respond to the movements because the movement constituency is also their voter constituency. If you don't have that, the movement is extraordinarily exposed and vulnerable. We all know that Trump is capable of practically anything. And in the closing moments, when he gets really scared, we'll be in danger. The movements will be in danger. That's why it's good that the Democrats, especially younger, more left Democrats, won the last election. That's really a big relief. So this is, I think this is a kind of perspective on the different kinds of political work we do that is very, very constructive. I also wanted, when I was thinking about coming here and, you know, what am I going to say and so forth, I wanted to make another kind of point. You know, I think movements are extraordinarily important. Movements keep parties honest. They're never totally honest, but they keep them as honest as they're going to be. But movements do different kinds of things. And so far in this movement period, we've really only seen the movements do the first kind of thing. And the first kind of thing is this. We display ourselves. We line up with people like us, and we say, look, there are thousands of us, and isn't that great? And we encourage each other, and that's why we have banners and marches and demonstrations. It's to show us to ourselves. The movement builds its morale, its courage, and its sense of what its politics are. That's one thing that movements do. But the great movements in history have done something else. They've also changed their societies. And they haven't done that just by marching, just by demonstrating, holding up banners, singing great songs, even by putting out the funniest paper I've seen in a long time. Movements exert power by exercising a kind of collective refusal to cooperate that shuts down major institutions. Now, our best example of that is the strike. But there are all kinds of strikes. They're not just striking General Motors or coal miners striking. They're ordinary people striking by refusing to obey the rules of traffic, for example, by refusing the niche that they've been assigned by institutional norms. And we have not really developed that capacity or acted on that capacity yet. But I think we have to. And we have to begin to think about the ways to do that. Some of the ways we've already seen. The school teachers have been great in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Tennessee and Los Angeles. That's a very familiar kind of strike, but listen, it happened in the most unlikely parts of the country, among the most unlikely movement activists. And the grievances they experienced, together with their own imaginative resources, led them to become a kind of beacon for what the social movements can do. So, but we have to think about other things. Well, before that, we have to join their picket lines. You know, Barbara Ehrenreich and Gary Stevenson wrote an op-ed in the Times a week or so ago, suggesting that federal workers who are being called back to work without pay, like the TSA workers, should go on strike. That means they'll forfeit the pay that they're now at least formally owed by the federal government. But you know, it's something else. They should strike. Can they strike? I don't know. I'm not there. But we should be out on the picket lines with them. Lots of people from the movement community should join in the strike actions that occur. Then we also ought to think of different kinds of strikes, like fouling up the traffic patterns of the big cities. That's all. Cities only work because we obey so many rules. It would really not take an awful lot for them to stop working. And we have to begin to think about the strategies and tactics through which we can exercise a kind of citizen strike power by finding other rules that are accessible to us that we can refuse to obey. You know, still another thing, way back in the 1970s, there was a lot of talk about a tax strike. At that point in time, the issue was the Vietnam War. And the anti-war movement was searching for ways in which to exercise definitive pressure on the Nixon administration to end the war. Well, that wasn't, it was a half good idea. If the tax strike had occurred, it would have been a definitive blow to the federal government, to its revenues. But it was only a half good idea because nobody could figure out how to organize people to do something that was so private and so hidden as not making out the check that they owed to the Internal Revenue Service. But that's the way we ought to be thinking now. how do we take this movement moment and the marvelous display by people of who they are and what they believe in, and how do we move it to the next stage of becoming a fighting force that can change American society and therefore change the world.
Wow. What an honor to be in your presence. So going back to the question that you asked about, what's the essence of the movements that we've seen over the last 2 years? I mean, this is kind of an obvious point, but worth lingering on. It's been a moment of the resurgence of the feminist movement, and with all its contradictions and difficulties. I don't know that we would be anywhere near where we are had it not been for the Women's March, creating the space for millions of people to show up the day after inauguration. And I think that, what preceded Trump, I think it's important. We saw 10 years leading up to the election of incredible moments. We saw Occupy, we saw in 2006 and 2007, immigrant rights, incredible demonstrations of political courage happening in immigrant communities across the country. We saw the movement for Black lives. And those three key movement moments have really shaped have really created like an ideological grounding for a generation of people that today are running for office, are voting, and are shaping these conversations. And so that, I think, both the contradictions of white feminism and the challenge that we have as a society to actually understand history and each other's history and respect each other's perspective are really, I think, very much central to how exciting and how challenging it has been for people to both, once they join, stay and take leadership from people that are not exactly like them. I think we saw, a week ago, not even a few days ago, all the controversy around the Women's March. And I think that I've seen really valiant efforts over the last 2 years of organizations trying to really insist on creating, kind of elucidating for people the connection between racism and patriarchy and how central both are to Trumpism, to the white nationalist program, and how important it is for people to reckon with both. I think of these moments as kind of that the Trump election created a moment of kind of unveiling for millions of people, a reality that was very immediate to Black folks, to poor folks, to immigrant folks in this country, which was the reality of racism and xenophobia and how central that is to the American enterprise. And so there has been a lot of unveiling and a lot of challenging the people who you describe as kind of living comfortable lives that are now feeling very much like their lives are also at risk. Their future, their imagination is being narrowed by these administration's powers. I think the other thing is I don't think that we as a society really understood the intensity of the powers of a president. And for immigrant communities, it has been a relentless relearning of how little power we have when we don't have Congress to protect us, when we don't have the courts to stand in between the most abusive administration and us. So we have lost a lot. We've lost TPS, we've lost DACA, we are maybe gonna deepen the militarization of the border. And So and at the same time, like, we have seen the country for the first time stare at the reality of immigration enforcement and what it looks like and how ugly it is and how much it looks like children in cages, torn away from their families, very much following a very long tradition in this country of stealing children from their families, or it's Native American children, the children of people who were enslaved. And so that kind of the reckoning that has been forced on people who are not directly impacted has been really powerful. I have seen lots and lots of women show up for moments that are that just I had never seen in 20 years of organizing in the immigrant rights field. Thousands of people showing up to the airports, thousands and thousands of people marching across the country on multiple moments of immigrant attacks. Obviously, the separation of families at the border and the kind of the outpouring of action that created. So there is a lot to feel incredibly proud and hopeful for, and also I think the reality that we keep having to learn, which is our power without our ability to transform these movement energy into long-term electoral victories is quite narrow. And so that's, I have experienced moments of great inspiration and also great disappointment. The Kavanaugh moment was precisely one of those. It was, I met so many people, so many women in particular, who literally heard there was a bus leaving from New York, and they got on the bus and then ended up staying in DC for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We took over the halls of Congress for 31 days. 31 days.